Well, thanks everybody for coming, and I've come about, well, I've actually done about 700 miles to get here, because I went from Scotland via Banbury, where I interviewed a 96-year-old man whose father was the works foreman at the Osborne Engineering Company in Portsmouth, where they built motorcycles from about 1920 through to about 1958 or 59. And my brother had interviewed him 25 years ago, and I decided on this trip I would try and contact this chap's son, who we knew lived somewhere near Banbury. And so I looked at where he lived and put a little message into the pub next door to where his cottage was, because I couldn't find a phone number. And they said, yes, we know Raymond Duke, we'll pass him your number. So the phone rang a couple of days later, and it was an old voice on the phone. And I said, Raymond, thanks for ringing me. Well, no, this isn't Raymond, this is Dennis Duke. I said, Dennis Duke? Well, can I ask what age you are? I'm 96. I said, blimey. I said, my brother interviewed you 26 years ago and you're still alive. I can't believe that. And I've just, boned up all about this story that I was going to try and get some more information out of his son. And I actually went and visited him on Wednesday morning in Banbury and had an hour of really lovely conversation. And he's completed the full shilling. And I added considerably to the knowledge that we had from the interview that we'd already recorded. And then after that, I went down to Stroud, where I picked up the archives of the Osborne Engineering Company mark specialist that I took over from in 1986. So I've been doing the job for 36 years, but the guy I took it over from had left the Vintage Motorcycle Club, and because he'd left the club, he could no longer do the job. So I kind of offered to take it on, and now he's actually quite near the end of his time, and he realised that if he doesn't do something with his material that he's gathered over his career, then it will simply be probably chucked out with a skip. So I went to his house and collected all his papers and research and so on, and thanked him very kindly and went on the way. And then on Thursday, I gave a talk to a group of people at Brooklands all about Frank Halford, who's a famous early motorcyclist who became an aero engine expert, whose albums recording when he learnt to fly at Brooklands. I was going to give a talk to Brooklands people about that, and then hand the albums to the Aerospace Library at Farnborough. So I've had quite a useful trip so far, and yesterday spent at Kew looking at more OEC material in the National Archive. But basically, I come over as a person interested in vehicles. Now I need to get my button pressing to the right button. Hang on. Right. This is me with my slightly older brother, aged about, I think, 18 months or something like that. And so the fact that I've ended up being involved with old vehicles is, I suppose, not really surprising. And in 1971, I went down to my brother's in Bristol and picked up, I actually went to visit him on a modern bike, a Bantam, rode from Edinburgh to Bristol on a Bantam, and in the next door garden to the flat where he lived was a bike underneath a tarpaulin, and it was an old Rudge. And in those days before mobile phones and all that stuff, I left a piece of paper on the saddle underneath the tarpaulin saying, if you're ever interested to sell this bike, I'd be interested to buy. And about 6 weeks later, I got a letter from Pilot Officer David Oakley, who said, my Cortina gearbox has just exploded and I need 60 quid to fix it. And can you give me 60 quid and the bike's yours? So I thought, well, that was a nice deal. So I went back down to Bristol, left the bike that I'd ridden down on with my brother to sell, and I put this Rudge on the road. 60 quid I paid, and I rode it back to Edinburgh. And that's it, after I'd sort of repainted bits of it and made it a bit smarter, but that's me, I suppose, in my early 20s. So it has to be kind of inevitable that you get involved in these things. And this is me in retirement now, outside my house in Scotland, in Tillicoultry, with a 1925 OEC Blackburn, which is basically, you can see it looks pretty scruffy. In fact, if you could see it up close, you'd realise it's even scruffier than this thing, because this was found literally with its wheels missing because somebody had not been able to put beaded edge tyres on the bike, so they decided to put wired-on rims onto the bike, and they cut all the spokes helpfully to change the wheel rims, and then the job had been abandoned. So I found the bike with only the hubs and forests of broken spokes, and I basically put it back together with old rims and old spokes, but looking like a complete bike now. And that you can still barely see the registration number on the front number plate, but that's how I rode it. But it had a Northern Ireland registration number that took about 10 years writing to the DVLNI in Northern Ireland, who kept replying by saying, in view of the security situation, we cannot divulge details of early motor vehicles, and sending my letter back. So after 10 years of trying, I finally got them to issue an export certificate so I could register the bike with DVLA, and it's got its original number on it still. So that was quite a challenge. But because I'm the VMCC mark specialist, I obviously look into things that relate to the mark, and I have a brother who's very interested in sunbeams. My oldest brother is the secretary of the Marston Sunbeam Club, Nick Shelley, and he basically spotted an auction in Billingshurst in Sussex in 2011, and this was basically what was offered. Tooby's auction house in Billingshurst was selling the medals and artifacts belonging to two brothers called Cecil and Alec Burney. And basically the medals are there. In fact, the medals are on the table. And with the medals came a little collection, a little archive. And the big picture shows one of the Burney brothers as he was part of the Royal Army Service Corps. And in the top left is an album of little tiny photographs about the size of cigarette cards. Again, the actual album is on the table over there, so at the end of the talk you can certainly go and have a look at it. And these basically were the remains, the sole remains of the two Burney brothers, because sadly neither of the Burney brothers had any family. One of them did marry, but they never had any children. So these albums, I don't know where they went to, but they were obviously in some, probably militaria collector, his collection, and he possibly died and sent them to an auction house, or they were sent to an auction house where I bought them. But as with auction houses, you can never really find out where they came from. So despite writing letters to the vendor, I never got any indication of where they come from. So, but I had these things. And as we were going, one of the items in the collection of archives was this little letter, which is quite lovely. And what basically happened was, I won't go the full story will come out, but this letter says to Mrs. Burney, who was the mother of these two brothers, we're very sorry to lose your son because he's been so helpful keeping our bikes running in the Western Front. I won't dwell on letting you read the letter because we'll come to it later in more detail. But I started looking into the matter of what these albums and medals might signify. And the first thing I came across was a piece of advertising material that the Vintage Motorcycle Club had in their collection. You can see there's a number 2 at the top, and it's stamped with the Vintage Motorcycle Club library. And this is an extract from Blackwood's magazine. Now, Blackwood's magazine, I guess you may not have heard of it, or perhaps you have. It was a very, very popular thing, published by a publisher in Edinburgh called George Blackwood. And it was a monthly magazine which had stories published in it, which then often built into books. So people like John Buchan, who wrote the book 39 Steps, that was first published in Blackwood's magazine as a series of monthly articles. Well, basically, in this advert is a story all about, extracted from Blackwood's magazine of July 1915, and it's somebody writing a testimonial. You know, the Blackburn alone is the finest and most even running of all motorcycles, and here is a Blackburn, the only actual surviving veteran Blackburn motorcycle in running order. In fact, I don't think there is another one. There's one that's supposed to be veteran, which is actually later faked up to look like a veteran, but that's a 1940 blackmail. So this piece of material led me to Blackwood's magazine. And Blackwood's magazine, you can see at the bottom, he said, "This is not an unthinking advertisement. After Despatch riding from August the 16th to February the 18th, my judgment should be worth something." And the Blackburn company, you know, you've got no connection with the company other than sincere admiration for the machine it produces, which is rather a nice testimonial. So I then went and got a book, because this magazine article, it was clear from when you research on the dreaded Google that the magazine articles, which were published as a series of monthly, effectively like letters home to the author's mother, by one of the members of a dispatch riders company, and Blackwood's editor went back to the man who had written the letters and said, could we put these letters together and make it into a book? And this book was published. And the book was called Adventures of a Dispatch Rider. And it was published in November 1915 by Blackwood's, and it was an immediate success. It sold extremely well. And so I got this copy of the book, but in that book, there's a very poignant little foreword. The book obviously was written by a man who had been at university before he went to fight the war. And basically in the front end of this book was a letter written to one of his university chums who was now in the Black Watch. So he wrote this letter to Lieutenant Robert White, all about when they used to sit around in the common room and talk about the great books they were going to write, because the chap who wrote this letter is this, he's now Captain Watson, Willie Watson, who was basically at university reading modern history, and Robert White, I think, was reading English. So they sat around in the common room and chatted about the books they were going to write and all the wonderful novels they were going to write. And he's basically saying that rather than writing a fancy novel, I'm writing a story about what I'm now doing in the war, which is riding a motorcycle, which wasn't quite what we imagined we'd be talking about when we were at university together. But it's a very nice little story. But literally at the bottom there's a postscript. The day after I'd written this letter, the news came to me that Robert White had been killed. But the letter must stand. I haven't the heart to write another. And I think that was really quite an interesting experience, because when these guys got caught up with the war, they all thought it was like a big adventure, and they all set off. And I'll go into more detail about that. But very soon into the war, they realized this was not fun. This was going to be a life and death matter. And so it turned out to be for someone. And in the book, there are a whole series of maps, and here indeed are in the front and rear of the book are the maps showing the Western Front and the campaign. And basically, they landed here, they sailed in from Dublin into the Havre River, and they went by train up to a place called well, it's basically the campaign that they were fighting was the campaign which became the Mons, the Battle of Mons. And they travelled by train up to where they fought the Battle of Mons. And famously, the Battle of Mons, the army met the advancing German troops. And there's a description which is used, which they refer to as the retreat from Mons, as if they were defeated at Mons. But the story, as told in the records of the First World War, is that they made a tactical withdrawal. They realized that they were not going to beat the Germans, so rather than actually go on fighting a battle they wouldn't win, they decided to withdraw. Now the Germans, for their part, imagined that the British Expeditionary Force would retreat to where they'd come from, in other words, out basically to the west, to the Havre or Dieppe, and maybe go back across the Channel, back to Britain. But in fact, the army from Mons didn't retreat back to the coast. They basically marched and drove and rode south. So they actually came right down to the side, they retreated from Mons, which is up here, right down this is Paris. They retreated down to a town called Soissons, which is here, which is kind of northeast of Paris. And then at that point, they basically dug in and they essentially chased the Germans. There was a river crossing which allowed them to create a strategic line against which they could defend the line. So once they'd crossed the river at Soissons, they essentially set up guns and offensive emplacements on the south side of the river, and they defended the point, and effectively they then chased the Germans back north. So that the tactical withdrawal, which was about 10 days, coming back from Mons south, that created a place where they could actually defend and go back up. Now, the actual album that was in this archive that I bought is a tiny little album, and again, it's probably appropriate because this the most important kind of artifact here is this, because this is what's called a VPK, and it's a folding Kodak camera which was invented in about 1908, I think, and the camera was basically known almost universally at the beginning of the war as the soldier's camera, because this camera, you could fold it down and put it in your pocket. So it was called, literally you can do that, a vest pocket Kodak camera, right? So this was, you could carry it around in your battle dress, and when you saw something interesting, you could stop and take a picture. Now, most people fighting the war weren't interested in taking pictures, they were more interested in protecting their own lives. But the fact is, this vest pocket Kodak camera had a very interesting and an early popularity with the soldiers who went to France with the British Expeditionary Force. And the actual camera runs little roll film, what they call 120 roll film, and the images that they produce are literally, as I said, the size of a cigarette card. They're tiny little pictures, and this is the album that Kodak provided, 4 to a page. Now, what was absolutely unbelievable when this little album arrived in my life, all of the images have got tiny little writing, beautifully handwritten captions in tiny little writing all along the bottom of the pictures. And that itself is quite unusual, because many of these albums have pictures which don't really have any identification, and many of the people that might know about what's in these pictures have all long since passed away. But these pictures, that's the camera, this is actually the very camera here. This is one I bought at the time. In these actual albums, I suddenly found things which are of great interest to me as the Blackburn and the OEC mark specialist. And this is Cecil Burney on Bouvry Station near La Bassée, which is very in the middle of the Western Front, practically on the French-Belgian border. And it says October 1914. And what you can see here is this bike very characteristically has a big flywheel, which is the distinguishing feature of the Blackburn motorcycle, which is there in front of you. You can, if it was the other way around, you could see the flywheel, belt drive motorcycle with the flywheel. And when you actually read the book, because when I got the copy of the Adventures of a Dispatch Rider, in the book there are lots of incidents described, and this is one where it talked about when they found, north of Soissons, in a village called Missy, there was literally a no man's land situation. There was a river running east and west with a village right in the bottom of the valley, obviously, called Missy, and that was essentially no man's land. The village had been abandoned, the Germans were to the north, and the British Expeditionary Force were defending from the south. And they'd heard that in the middle of Missy there was a motor car which had been abandoned, and it was a car that most people here probably have never heard of, called a Barre. Now, Barre is a Belgian company that built motor cars, again before the First World War. And this little open 4-seat Belgian car had been abandoned in the middle of Missy. So Cecil Burney, as it's written up in the book here, went with another of his dispatch rider friends, a guy called Hugh Trapesse, Huggy, and they went down under cover of darkness with a can of petrol. And they poured petrol into the car, and they managed to get it going, and they drove back out of the village to the south. And now the commanding officer, Captain Doherty Haldwell, has got a car to drive about in. And that car was part of the equipment of that signals company right through to the end of the war almost. Quite amazing. So that car is described. So in the albums, there is Cecil Burney at the wheel of the car that they rescued, and this was in my album. But one of the pictures in particular absolutely jumped out, and it's this one here, which has got 8 guys in it, and round the edge of the picture there are a whole bunch of names. Now the names, of course, are the names of the dispatch riders as they were written in the book. The author, Willie Watson, who's this great big tall guy here, he was actually 6'8" tall, and he's not standing on a box. He is genuinely head and shoulders bigger than everybody else in the picture, right? But this guy is the author of the book, so they didn't need to disguise his name, so he's Willie Watson. And this is he's actually an architect, Hugh Trapez, called Huggy. And this guy at the back here is Alec Burney, the younger of the 2 Burney brothers. And he in the book is called Grimers. And this little guy here is called Fatters. Now, why is he called Fatters? That's a curious one, right? These guys were, if you like, Edwardians, and they had a great sense of fun. Now, Mr. Fatters, his real name was Arnold Overton. And because he was over a ton, they called him Fatters. But you can see he wasn't over a ton, he was called Overton. But he was called Fatters, which was a little joke, and in fact he was about 10 stone and quite a slim, dapper guy. And in later life, during the Second World War, he rose to fame. His actual name in the 40s was Sir Arnold Overton. And Sir Arnold Overton went to America towards the end of the Second World War as an envoy from Winston Churchill. And he literally went, he was sent by Winston Churchill to negotiate with the Americans what was called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. Because basically Britain could see, well, Churchill for sure could see, that we'd spent the First World War knocking 7 bells out of all of our European compatriots. So, in fact, at that point, in the First World War, Britain's trading partners in Europe were still significant parts of our economy. We traded a huge amount with the world. We obviously sold to the Commonwealth and our former empire, or our actual empire, because in that stage we still had an empire, but we still traded hugely with France, with Italy, with Germany. But when the war was coming to an end, and this is actually after at the end of the Second World War, Churchill wanted to be sure that Britain had a trading relationship with the Americans, because up until that point the Americans hadn't really been particularly strong partners, and also they'd had a lot of barriers to trade, which were because of the actual the duties that they charged to prevent goods being shipped into America. So the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade was to try and open up world markets. It's a bit like in the Brexit, post-Brexit situation, we're trying to sell things to India and China and Australia and wherever else, anywhere but Europe, because we've just told Europe we don't like them. So that's where we're going, right? And this guy here is our friend Cecil Burney. And interestingly, in almost every picture, he's usually wearing this, which looks like a hat, but it's actually a balaclava. But you basically roll it back up again, and you've now got a balaclava as a woolly hat. And this is George Owen. And Spuggy, his name's Bagshaw, Spuggy Bagshaw. And he was actually from South Africa. And his father had a leather business in South Africa. And the main business that they had was making boots for the army. So when, towards the end of the war, Spuggy actually decided, his father died, and he decided he really needed to get back to South Africa, because he ended up going back to South Africa. to run the business, which was making boots for the British Army. And then this little guy here, Sadders. Now Sadders is the guy whose daughter is alive. She's in her late 80s now. And she basically has agreed that her father's archives, all the papers, things like the armbands that he wore, all of those things can be given to the museum here to join the archive that I've presented, which is the Burning Archives. So this guy here, Cecil Hayes Sadler, and there's another bit of a story attached to him I'll go into in more detail. But on the back of that picture, there was literally this set of handwritten names. So the same print that had the nicknames around the edge of the picture, which connected to the names that were used in the book, were these, which were the real names: Watson and Trapesse and Alec Burney and Polhill, Hayes Sadler, Bagshaw. So that was a really nice way to unlock the information about who these people really were. And my older brother, as well as being the Sunbeam not Mark Specialist, he's the Sunbeam Club Secretary, he's also very involved in genealogical research. And he went into overdrive and he started looking into the names and details of people who were dispatch riders and trying to figure out how many actual dispatch riders went. Now, when we started this process, there was basically, I'll go back to the previous one. If you asked anybody who knew about this subject, military research people, they all said, oh, there was probably about 100 people riding motorcycles, possibly 150. The biggest number we could ever get from anybody that knew about it was about 150 people. And thereby hangs the revelation that came out with this, because when my brother started really going into the detail in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and in the records that exist all over the place, we discovered there weren't 150, there were hundreds of them. There were literally over 400 of them actually landed in France in 1914. And what marked them out as different was the fact that they were all motorcyclists. Because when the war was effectively declared at the beginning of August 1914, the army chiefs realized that they didn't have, but would urgently need, motorized dispatch riders to keep the units of the British Expeditionary Force in contact with one another once they were in France. Because when they were in France, they were all driving around, they didn't have walkie-talkies, there were no mobile phones, and the only form of communication they could reasonably have between the disparate units of the army was actually motorized motorcycle dispatch riders. But they didn't have time to buy the bikes and train the men. So they went out in with a huge effort to the motorcycle press, looking for basically young, fit people, men, I'm afraid to say, with motorcycles who would be able to be recruited to come and join with the British Expeditionary Force as motorcyclists riding mostly their own machines. I say mostly their own machines because if you were a motorcyclist and your bike wasn't of a correct specification, then the army wouldn't have it. If your bike didn't have a clutch, for example, or didn't have enough gears, they wanted bikes with clutches and gears rather than just single speed bikes. This is actually a single speed bike, but it's got a clutch. But that actual bike wouldn't be eligible without a gearbox, but quite a lot of them had gearboxes in the back hub. That one hasn't, it's got a clutch. But that vehicle wouldn't be eligible because it's only got a single speed. But the people who had skills would actually come and a motorbike would be bought for them because they had already demonstrated their aptitude. So I'm going the wrong way. And when we looked at all the pictures, we could now identify all the people in these pictures, and we could start to work out where they all were. And we knew from the book where they'd been because the actual route that this 5th Signals Company followed is delineated in the book, because the book, when it was published in 1915, didn't have any pictures in it, but it did have a series of maps, and the maps showed quite clearly where the Signals Company had travelled. And they started literally they arrived in Le Havre, and then they got a train which took them up to Mons. Right? And in the process of this actual expertise, we ended up. This is the lady in the little tiny lady beside me is a girl called Sue Elphick, and her father is Sadler's, Cecil Hayes Sadler, whose archives I think are going to come to the museum. And interestingly, she, unlike most of the people in this group, were all unconnected, except they were all dispatch riders together in the same company. But actually, Cecil Hayes Sadler, her father, married the next guy's aunt, because the guy to the right in the middle is a guy called David Danson, and his father was Jack Danson, who's another one of the dispatch riders, and his sister married one of the other dispatch riders. So these two, Sue Elphick and David Danson, are actually first cousins, because and Roselle is David's sister, and that's my brother on the right. So these three people in the middle were the only members of the dispatch riders group that knew each other, because literally one of them had married the sister of another one, so they became friends after the war. And these are some of the bits and pieces that we got from Sue. This is a little, like a wax cotton, well, an oilskin, I think they call it, mat case, the bottom right, and above is the famous brassard. Now, if you were riding a motorcycle in France and you weren't wearing this band around your arm, which is a piece of felt which is blue at the top and white at the bottom, and now 100 odd years later it doesn't look very fine in blue and white, but that actual brassard is the brassard that her father Sadler's rode with in the British Expeditionary Force, and that is coming to the museum from her collection. And one of the other people we met was this guy, Roger Polhill, whose father was Stanley Polhill, and he was actually the sergeant of the group, and he was called Pollers. Now, when in December 1914, you may have heard of the Christmas truce.
Yes.
Have you heard of the Christmas truce?
Yes.
In 1914, on Christmas Day, at the front, German troops and French and British troops got out of their respective trenches and met in the middle of no man's land. And they shook hands and they exchanged gifts, bottles of schnapps swapped for bottles of whiskey. And they sang songs together, and they basically fraternized. And unfortunately for the British Army, one of them had a camera, a West Pocket Kodak camera, and he took pictures of this jollity going on Christmas Day. And the West Pocket Kodak picture taken on Christmas Day of the German and British soldiers fraternizing was published in the middle of January on the front page of the Daily Mail. And within a week, the army had issued an edict that no serving soldier should have a camera in Europe. In other words, if you were overseas, you were not allowed to have a camera. Indeed, it was a court-martialing offence if you were found with a camera. So it makes the pictures that we have, which were taken in 1914 with one of these cameras, even more precious, because from basically the end of 1914, early 1915 onwards, it was literally a court-martialing offence if you were found with a camera. So the number of VPK pictures that are around from after that period are very, very few and far between. But one of the things that they did on Christmas Day, the dispatch riders, they started out as 12 of them, and in this situation, 2 of them had actually, for one reason or another, one of them had been killed, because in 3 days into France, one of them got killed by a sniper. Fielding Johnson didn't make it beyond the 3rd day in France. And one of the other dispatch riders suffered from piles. Now you might smile and think, gosh, that's a bit of a problem, piles. Well, piles is a bit like trench foot. It sounds funny, but it's anything but funny if you're trying to ride a motorcycle. So basically he was sent back to recover, to recuperate. And so he wasn't at the front. He wasn't able to go to a Christmas lunch that they had. But basically, they set up a Christmas lunch at an estaminet, like a little brasserie in a village where they were staying on the Western Front. And that event was celebrated because Cecil Burney's brother Alec was a very good calligrapher. He was a very fine writer. And the album which I have, which is his album, has the little tiny writing all around the pictures, which is in his tiny writing. Well, that actual menu, he wrote literally 10 menus. And those 10 menus have the names of all the 10 people who were actually in this group. The 10 surviving dispatch riders of the 5th Signals Company, it says on the front. And then inside the front, it lists all the campaigns that they'd survived together. And there are now literally 2 of these menus have survived. One of them belongs to this chap, Roger Polhill, whose father's menu it is. And again, Cecil Hayes Sadler, his daughter, has his menu. So that menu will also be in the museum collection, which is really lovely. There it is there. And what's quite interesting is, when you look at the names, Cecil Burney and Cecil Hayes Sadler, Huggy Trapesse, Eric Bagshaw, Arnold Overton, and that's Alec Burney, and William Watson, and Orr, and Pollers. I'm trying to, oh, that's, can't read that name. But there it says there, SF Polhill, Christmas 1914. Dinner of the 10 surviving motorcyclists of the famous 5th Division at the Maison Commune Estaminet Saint-Jean-Capelle. And that estaminet is still in the village today. And the guy, the grandson of William Watson, the big tall guy who wrote the original book, was meant to be coming today, but he's actually in France. And I've told him, I sent him a copy of this and reminded him, and he's going to try and go and visit this little estaminet, and have him and his wife are going to have a meal. They have a house in northern France, so they're quite close to there. And that's what they're hoping to do, not actually this weekend, probably next weekend, but that little, the writing, interestingly, the writing here, this is Alec Burney's writing. And I actually have a book here, which is Alec Burney's copy of the book. Now, it's actually the other one. There's a second copy, which is a second edition. And in the front, it has the names of all the characters and the names of the real people in Alec Burney's hand. So it's him explaining to whosoever had the book that that's what they were really called. And that's an amazing survivor, a piece of ephemera that you would never imagine would survive. That's the actual, those are the campaigns: Mons, Le Cateau, Crépy-en-Valois, the Marne, the Aisne, La Bassée, and the defence of Ypres. Because of course where they spent most time was very close to where Ypres was. And at the end of the war, Ypres was completely flattened. There was virtually nothing standing. And in these, in the process of looking into who had actually been dispatch riders, as I say, we gathered together a list of about 400 names. And as well as the album that I had found, which was the Burney Brothers album, Cecil Hayes Sadler, his album survived, and also Pollers. Pollers, at the end of the war, had gone as he was actually a qualified engineer. He graduated with an engineering degree from Cambridge. And at the end of the war was so terrible that they didn't stay in Britain. He literally went, he became involved in farming in Africa. And he went out to Kenya. And he went to Kenya to help run a huge, big mechanized farm in Kenya. And this farm used farm machinery, and being a qualified engineer, he was engaged basically to maintain big farming machines, I suppose harvesters and plows and things. And while he was there, he had a terrible accident, which ended up with him losing a lung. And he was very lucky to survive, but he did survive. But because he lost a lung, he wasn't able to go on running a big farm. So they bought a small farm holding up in the hills in Kenya, and he started growing a plant you might have heard of called African pyrethrum, which is a flowering plant which has a natural insecticide in it. And you may remember the insecticides that you used to get called flit, which you'd have a little pump that would spray this insecticide and kill all the flies in the kitchen. Well, that flit insecticide was based on pyrethrum. And Paul Hill's father, or Apollos, who's Roger Pollard's father, became an African pyrethrum grower. And as a result, his son became fascinated in botany, African botany. So in the 50s, young Roger actually went to Britain, came back from Kenya to Britain, and he studied botany at Cambridge. And he graduated with a botany degree from Cambridge. And the only time that his father, Pollers, Stanley Polhill, came back from Kenya to Britain after he went to Kenya in 1921 was to attend his son's graduation at Cambridge. All the rest of the time they stayed out in Kenya. But Roger left Cambridge with a botany degree and went to work at Kew Gardens as a botanist. But his subject was East African flora. So he ended up spending all of his life traveling out to East Africa, where his parents lived, collecting rare plants from East Africa, which is of course where his father had become a world famous pyrethrum grower. But he then, he's still alive, he lives again. He might have come to this talk today, but unfortunately he again had difficulties getting here in his late 80s. But he's not long retired from Kew, but he still publishes books on East African flora, so he's an expert in the field. And he, when his father went out to Africa, he took his photographs, because it was Stanley who had the best pocket Kodak camera that all these pictures were taken with. And what he'd done was they put all the little negatives into little wax paper envelopes, as they did in the day. You know, the actual paper envelopes were waxed paper that you put the envelopes had the individual negatives in. But with the heat of Africa, all the wax had melted onto the negatives. And weirdly, they had made prints at the time, but the prints had all been given away to the other Despatch riders, including the Burney brothers. So all the pictures in the album I had were actually from the negatives that were Pollard's negatives, which had been literally given away. So Pollard's and his son, well, Roger, the son, had never seen the pictures. And here was the problem. All of the negatives were in the little waxed paper envelopes, but they were all stuck in because the heat of Kenya had melted all the wax onto the negatives. So Roger, when we started talking about how we would get these images and make them part of our book, because we wanted to republish this book, which didn't have photographs, in a new version with photographs. And Roger very sportingly said, well, they're my family pictures, I'll pay to have them restored. And I then had the job of finding somebody capable of taking these original 1914 negatives out of their little paper envelopes and removing the wax without destroying the images. Well, the end result was that we found the Fox Talbot Museum of Photography, which is down near Bath. We found a photo restorer who took on the job of literally carefully removing these little negatives from their original bags, their little paper bags, and removing the wax and then scanning them, and we then were able to capture the pictures. Now, one of the pictures, I'm not sure whether it will come now, hopefully it might. This picture was when the Despatch riders left. What I didn't describe was they came almost to here when they advertised that they wanted recruits from the world of motorcycling. Motorcyclists were told to come to sign up with the Royal Engineers Signals Regiment. And this here, in this part of Kent, is the epicenter of the Royal Engineers Regiments. But also, it was where they set up the recruitment station for the dispatch riders. So they were actually between this site and the site at Chatham Dockyard. So they all came with their motorcycles to Chatham and various other places around Britain, but mainly here. And they all basically brought their own motorcycles, and they were asked to demonstrate that they knew their motorcycles well enough to actually keep them running in a battle. So they came, and when they'd actually been signed up, they then went by train from London down to Fishguard, and they crossed on like the boat train that went from Fishguard across to Dunleary in the Irish, on the Irish east coast, and they went to a camp at Carlow, which is about 50 miles south of Dublin, where they learned. They were all motorcyclists, but they had to learn to be soldiers. So they basically were given elementary training on using a rifle and keeping their rifle clean and marching and all that kind of stuff. But interestingly, all the dispatch riders, when they were recruited, they weren't just called privates, they were all given the rank of corporal. Why were they given the rank of corporal? Well, they were just ordinary recruits. You'd have thought they'd have been privates. But the whole purpose behind the dispatch riders was they were taking messages from the head of one unit to the head of another unit. So they had to be able to approach a senior officer without being asked to be spoken to. And it was the tradition in the army that if you were a private, you were literally not allowed to speak until you were spoken to. So if you were a dispatch rider, you were made a corporal so that you could speak to anybody. You could actually say, "Excuse me, sir, I have a message for Brigadier somebody," and you would actually be able to hand over the message. But if you weren't a corporal, at least, you weren't allowed to speak. So that was why they were all made corporals. Now, one of the number, Pollers, Sergeant Polhill, was a sergeant. Why was he made a sergeant? Well, because when he'd been at school, he'd been in what they call the OTC, the Officer Training Company. So when in the pre-First World War period, there was this quasi-military activity at schools, big secondary schools had these groups which were essentially like army cadets. They were called the Officer Training Corps. And they were people who were considered as likely to be in demand by the army. So these were, as it were, better trained than people just ordinary motorcyclists. And they, in this case, Pollers was made the sergeant, so he became Sergeant Polhill from the get-go. And in these albums, we've got the pictures of them on the ship sailing from Ireland out to Le Havre. And when they went from there, they went up to the front at Mons on a railway line. Now, what you can see here, these are the guys, sitting in the carriages. But also here, you can see what look like big carts. Now, these famously were signals carts, because once the army got to France and they started becoming entrenched, they dug themselves in to make the front the front. They used these carts to lay signal wires along the trenches. And those carts, literally there were hundreds of them, laying all the communications so that they could use Morse telegraphy in the front, wireless telegraphy, or wire telegraphy, not wireless. And these carts, there is literally only one of these carts have survived, and it's at the Signals Museum at Blandford Forum, which Rebecca mentioned this at the beginning. It's the other museum, it's the Signals Museum, which deals with the whole engineering side of signalling. And there's only one of these carts survives, but there's a whole load of them on a rover train. And in the album also, here's a group of the guys sitting at the station at Vouvry, which is one of the places we now know they spent quite a lot of time through the winter of 1914. And again, you can recognise all the characters, and that's Cecil and Alec Burney. And this is Huggy Trapesse and Sadders, and this is a French guy who was basically one of the kind of military people that they had dealings with. And this is Pollers. And what you see here is Pollers is wearing quite an unusual pair of goggles on his helmet, on his hat. And they didn't wear crash helmets, of course, they just wore military uniform, puttees on their legs, and just ordinary hats. And in fact, again, I was browsing at somewhere where I could see various interesting bits of memorabilia, and one of them was a pair of goggles, which is exactly these goggles that I've never seen before, which are rectangular goggles with curved glass. And actually, again, I bought them because it seemed ideal to do so. So they're part of the archive I've passed to the museum, these unusual little goggles. And what we've now done, we've put all this back together. We took the original book published in 1915 and we basically republished it as a new book. It isn't called Adventures of a Dispatch Rider any longer, it's now called Two Wheels to War. And Two Wheels to War has a complete copy of the original book in the middle, which is 55,000 words. But the book we produced is 130,000 words, so it's twice as big. So in that book, we've got the original book. At the back of it, we've got a list of these dispatch riders that actually went to France in 1914. And you'll see in this list, there are names greyed out because that's Eric Bagshaw, Spuggy, and there are the two Burney brothers. So all the greyed out names in the names in the list, and there's probably about 7 or 8 pages of them. The ones that are greyed out are the characters in our book. And that is a great piece of, if you're genealogical research minded and you have an ancestor who you think might have been a dispatch rider, it's very probable they'll be in this list. And this gives you their service numbers, their dates of birth and death, and the date on which they landed in France. And the interesting thing to note here is when you look at the dates of birth and death, how many of these dispatch riders actually survived the war. And in fact, because the dispatch riders were riding their bikes essentially behind the front line rather than actually on the front line, they actually survived in significant numbers. Whereas if you look at the attrition of infantrymen, shall we say, often the infantrymen, 70 or 80 or even 90% of them didn't survive the war. So the attrition rate of dispatch riders was rather less than the attrition rate for normal soldiers. Most of them didn't spend the whole war as dispatch riders because they started out as corporals, and quite quickly they realized that the secret to survival was not remaining in the dispatch rider's service, but getting a commission and becoming an officer. So many of them left the dispatch riding service, and interestingly, many of them joined the Royal Flying Corps and became pilots or observer airmen. And again, Stanley Pollers, he ended up going to the Royal Flying Corps, and he wanted to be a pilot because, again, one of the features of the front was watching the planes flying over the top. When you were out there in the front, you were being observed by both British and French aircraft and the Germans, looking down at what the other side were doing from the safety, if you like, of the air. And when Pollers went to become a pilot, he came back to Britain, and in fact he went to Troon in Scotland. In fact, it's where Donald Trump's golf course is, right on the coast at Troon, where there's now a golf course. And he learned to fly there, but he was judged to be far too bright to just be a pilot. So he was, in fact, given the job of being an observer. And you would think that the pilot was more important than the observer. But the observer is essentially the intelligent pair of eyes that tells the pilot what to do. You know, it's a bit like the famous story about the astronaut who was given instructions to feed the monkey. It was the monkey that was doing the clever work, and all he had to do was feed the monkey. While in this case, the observer was telling the pilot what to do. The pilot wasn't making decisions. He was being instructed what to do by the observer. So Pollers ended up actually not not even spending the rest of the war as an observer, because what he ended up doing was he met and married somebody in Troon, and he ended up spending the rest of his war years teaching people how to be an observer, and in fact particularly how to use a camera, because a lot of the work of the aviation in the war was about reconnaissance. It was about aerial photography from an aircraft. From quite a high altitude, the aircraft that they flew were flying to 18 or 20,000 feet without any kind of pressurized cockpits, without any kind of, well, stout clothing to ward off the cold weather, but bitterly cold, holding a camera out the side of the plane and taking pictures of the trenches. And it's quite amazing the amount of information that they gathered from that method. So this data's in the book, over 10 pages of it. And when we started looking into the actual history of the book, this company, Blackwoods, was a publisher based in Edinburgh, although Blackwoods magazine was a very widely distributed publication, and their books were widely distributed as well. But Blackwoods, as a publisher, folded in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, they decided, when they closed the company, to send all the archives of the publishers to the National Library of Scotland. So I live in Scotland now. I was actually born and brought up in Scotland, but spent a lot of my career in London and even in Australia. While I was in Edinburgh, I went to the National Library of Scotland, and I found all the original letters that William Watson had written to the publisher, George Blackwood, and his replies. And one of the letters is a letter, because when Watson wrote letters home, his mother collected the letters home and sent them to a chap who was a schoolmaster at Harrow School, which is where Watson had been to school. And the history teacher at Harrow, instead of putting them into the school magazine, which is what Watson's mother imagined would happen, she didn't know that the history teacher at Harrow was actually a literary scout for Blackwoods. So he basically took these letters and he bundled them up and he sent them to his friend George Blackwood in Edinburgh. And George Blackwood looked at the letters and said, we can do something with these. And that's where he made the decision to start publishing a monthly extract from William Watson's letters home to his mother. So they started appearing under a monthly series entitled Adventures of a Dispatch Rider. And then in February 1915, Watson moved on from being in the dispatch riding game, and he was basically put in charge, he was commissioned and put in charge of a cycle dispatch riders brigade who rode bicycles rather than motorcycles. But he became a lieutenant running this cycle brigade. And while he was a cycle brigade lieutenant, he got a shrapnel wound. So he was sent back to Britain to recover. And while he was at Purbright Camp, which was near Aldershot, recuperating from the shrapnel wound, Blackwood heard that he'd been sent home. And he wrote to Watson at Purbright Camp and said, would you like to take the letters that you've written and make them into a book? So basically, this is Watson's reply, which says the book might consist of an introduction, a prologue, a series of articles, and a discourse all about riding, and also maps and other things. And indeed, he said, 2 or 3 simple but good maps. And one of the most powerful bits of the original book is the fact that they contain maps. And in fact, in the back of the original book, and this is again a rare survival, because the original book has maps throughout. Every so often, you see, there we are. That's an example of the maps. Oops, it's a piece of paper. But actually, in the back of the book, in the first edition, there's literally a huge a huge fallout now, which is again a remarkable thing. Published in the middle of the war, showing what was going on in the war. Now, curiously, the book was published in 1915, November 1915, and the censor's office were unaware that this book had been published. Why was the book not put through the censor's office when it was originally published? Well, the simple answer was that the letters that Watson had written had been passed through the censor's office when they were sent as part of his mail home from the Western Front back to his mother in Harrow. So when Watson's correspondence was passed to, indirectly via Harrow, to Blackwood's presumed that they had already been censored, so they wouldn't need to be censored when they produced the book. But in March 1916, literally something like 5 months after the book had been published, somebody pointed out to the censor's office that this book had appeared. And when you look at this book from the point of view of a censor, there are all sorts of things in it that the censor took issue with. So instantly, Watson got sent a letter by the censor's office and told to withdraw the book from sale. So he then passed the message from the censor's office to Blackwood, who were the publishers, and the publishers were forced to withdraw it from sale. So in 1916, March 1916, the book ceased to be available for sale, which really annoyed Blackwood because he'd sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and it had been a very popular seller. So basically they sent it to the censor's office, and the censor's office took about a year to decide what bits of the book were acceptable and what bits of the book should be expurgated. So then, by 1917, basically Blackwood's reprinted the book, but in a new form, which they called the Shilling edition, which is a smaller actual book physically. It's got smaller margins, but the actual text is virtually the same, except, significantly, it's had big chunks taken out. And the big chunks that are taken out reveal quite a lot about what the censor thought was unhappy material to be in a book. Like anything that was critical of British Army decisions, anything that was critical of the French. And bizarrely, phrases which appear in the book were allowed to stand in the expurgated version. And one phrase which I simply cannot believe wasn't taken out by the censor is when, in the introduction, Watson refers to the men being sent to the front as being gun fodder. Now, you think what the word gun fodder means. You know, somebody being sent to stand up and be knocked down by enemy guns. And that is a phrase that apparently came out of the Chinese, well, I think it's one of the campaigns in the Far East where that phrase about gun fodder, and I think it was partly because the Chinese had so many men, they could literally kill millions of men and still be able to fight because they had enough people to be calling on. And when you see the words gun fodder in the text of the book, it's very hard not to think, maybe somebody missed it, maybe they didn't read it very thoroughly. But it's an interesting phrase that it wasn't removed by the censor. But what we've done when we republished the book is we've basically identified, as you go through the book, we've identified where the text was removed in the second edition, which was in the first edition. So you read the book inside our book, and you read the entire original text, and as you read it, you come across the bits that were flagged up as needing to be removed. And one of the things that was in the archive in Edinburgh was the original little sketch. And of course, this was the 6'9" Willie Watson on the left, with a little tubby sergeant with his swagger stick. And Watson had this, somebody did this little caricature of him and the little sergeant, who was a tubby little man. And Watson wrote to Blackwood and said, "One of my fellow signalmen has done this little cartoon, and I think it would be nice if it went on the cover of the book. So that is literally the original of the cartoon, which is in the archives in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, which we found, and we reproduced it. The original, well, of course, we reproduced it in the book anyway. So in April 2017, we had this revised, this reissued book ready to launch. And it's a considerably bigger thing than the original book. We produced it, unfortunately, in a rush, in the sense that we didn't have time, when we finished putting the book together, to put an index in the back of it. Now, anybody who reads this kind of book will understand that an index is a very important piece of any book when you want to look at it and find things that are buried in it. The index gives you a way of finding things. Once you've read a book, you can go back in and find the things you want to find again. But you can't write an index of a book until you've completely finished it. So when we launched the book, we only had 4 weeks from finishing the book text to actually launching the book at the Stafford Classic Bike Show in April 17. So we did it without an index, but very quickly the first printing sold out. So the publishers reprinted it very quickly from the same proofs. And then in 2018, nearly, I suppose, 18 months after we launched the book, I got from the National Archives at Kew their Christmas book list. And I was delighted to see that the National Archives at Kew had put our book into their Christmas book list. And a week after the book list appeared, I got a letter from the publisher telling me that they had run out of the next printing. So literally, anybody who wanted to buy the book from the National Archive Christmas book list, it was out of print. And it took the publishers nearly a year to republish it. They refused to publish it. They refused to reprint it. They could have had a printing done in about a week, about 3 weeks. So they could have had a stock replaced in time to honour orders from the Kew book list, but they didn't want to do that. So having missed the chance of that, I said to the publishers, in which case, if you're not going to publish it quickly, can we please make a second edition? And they said, well, I suppose yes. They didn't like the idea because it meant them spending more money on it. But basically, we took the book, we added the index into the back of the book, which makes it a much better book. There were 1 or 2 tiny little factual errors in the original book, because after the book was published, 5 weeks after the book was published, we had a reunion at one of the, in fact, at a museum in Basingstoke called Milestones Museum, which is a fantastic place if you know about it, and it's worth a visit if you don't. I know it's a competing museum to this one. This is another fabulous museum. But the Milestones Museum is basically in Basingstoke, and it's all about Hampshire manufactured goods, and I had a connection because of another project. So we ran this reunion there, and we had 50 of the relatives of the 12 dispatch riders present to discuss and meet and celebrate what their fathers and uncles and great uncles had achieved. And we also, in that meeting, we learned 1 or 2 things which we knew from what they were saying was wrong about the book. So we were able to correct tiny little errors in the book, and we were able, importantly, to add the index to the back of the book. And the final thing we were able to do was write a foreword, a second edition foreword, which told people about the fact that we'd had a reunion after the book was published of the 50 descendants of the dispatch riders in the original book. So that was another nice addition to the second edition, which makes the second edition really a more complete and finished thing. And so there's the finished book. The picture on the front cover is Pollers, the famous sergeant, sitting on one of the prototype Blackburns, which is the sister of this bike here. And unfortunately, the 2 Burney brothers went on their adventures to France, riding what were essentially the 2 prototype Blackburn motorcycles that they themselves had built. And sadly for Cecil, for Alec Burney's bike was parked beside the encampment where they were actually stopped for the night. And in the middle of the night, our own military truck drove past the back of the encampment and ran over his bike. So what they did was they took the engine out, because they could use the engine as a spare for his brother's bike. They took the petrol tank out. The two wheels were basically both damaged by the truck, so they were thrown away. But while the engineless and wheelless wreck of the bike was sitting there, Pollers sat across the bike and pretended to be riding a bike with no wheels and no engine and no petrol tank. So because that's actually the prototype of the Blackburn, it's quite amazing that that picture exists. And that picture was one of the pictures that was in one of these little wax envelopes, completely unusable because it was covered in melted wax. So that picture only survives because of the miraculous work of the photo restorers at the Fox Talbot Museum near Bath, Laycock Abbey. And as I say, a month later we ran this gathering at Milestones Museum, and there was this is another miracle of the wonders of the iPhone, the panoramic shot of the 50-odd people that were there for the actual event. And one of the characters in this picture here, who's a girl that's about, I suppose, 25, maybe 28, she's actually an Olympic gold medalist. She's Alex Danson, who was the captain of the gold medal winning basketball team at the London Olympics. And she was there with her father, who's David Danson, who's the son of one of the Despatch writers. So she is the granddaughter of one of the characters in the book. And it was quite an amazing event. We had such an amazing, well, we connected all these people together who were only connected by their grandfathers and fathers having been Despatch riders together. Most of them had never met each other. And you can imagine it was an amazing event. And I thought, because we've got people here who are interested in technical material, this is another point about these kind of images. When you find an image like this, we could read the registration number on the front of the bike. But the picture itself, I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with the original images. So there's the picture photoshopped. But here is a picture of the 3 prototype Blackburns at Brooklands in 1913. And there's the same number, AR3348. So the same bike that was in that picture with no wheels, no tank and no engine is that very bike here. With Alec Burney and Cecil Burney and Alan and Cecil Roberts, who were the 2 Roberts brothers. And these 4 guys were the directors of the Blackburn, Burney and Blackburn, who built the motorcycles in Tongham, off the Hog's Back, just outside Guildford in 1912, early 1913, in fact, those bikes were built. And those pictures were taken at Brooklands. That's the start and finish straight at Brooklands. And we went to the reunion. My brother, rather stupidly, when we launched the book, said, why don't we bring your Blackburn, which I had bits of but not restored, why don't you bring it to the launch of the book? So I tried very hard, but as far as I got, I never got the bike together to take it to Stafford. But in 5 weeks' time, we had the reunion. So I took to the reunion what was essentially the rolling chassis of the bike, the wheels and the forks and the tank. And that's my brother sort of pretending to be Pollers on the bike, only this bike's got no engine, but it's got wheels. And that's me riding the bike, a la Pollers. And if you watch a program called the Antiques Road Trip, that you might occasionally watch, one of the Antiques Road Trips paid a visit to Sammy Miller's museum in 2021. And to his considerable credit, the 80-something-year-old Sammy Miller managed to ride that bike round the yard at Bashley Manor for the cameras for the Antiques road trip. But the reason I disposed of it was because I don't have two great legs. And because there is no means of starting the bike other than pushing it along, and my legs aren't good enough for that, I decided I would move it on and get it to find a better home. And I couldn't have wished for a better home than to have it here on display, supporting this whole story. But when you look at the pictures in these albums, there's things about these pictures that give you an insight into what was actually going on. I don't know how many of you are knowledgeable about this picture, but this is a 1914 Douglas flat twin, 350cc, 2¾ horsepower. But anybody who knows about veteran Triumphs will immediately recognise that this horizontal spring and pivoting front fork is actually from a veteran Triumph. So here's a veteran Douglas with the front forks of a veteran Triumph. And of course that was why having the Burney brothers as part of the team running the Despatch riders in France was so good, because these guys were resourceful in a way that you really couldn't imagine. They could fit the front forks of one bike onto another bike, even though the front forks were off a Triumph, they could fit them on a Douglas, and that way keep another bike running. And that's actually Poller's, Stanley Polhill, with his famous brassards on his arms, white and blue bands on both arms. And if you see a picture of a bike with a military rider, and the rider is not wearing armbands, you can be absolutely certain that the picture wasn't taken in France or overseas, because any Despatch rider found riding a bike on the continent and not wearing brassards would basically be shot as a spy, because that was essentially why the Despatch riders wore brassards, so that they could essentially be identified by people who didn't know about these things as proper Despatch riders. So the brassard wasn't just a bit of insignia, it was life and death. If you didn't have it, you would be likely to be shot, and indeed people were shot for not wearing brassards. And the sort of bikes that these people rode, everybody talks about Douglases and Triumphs. Indeed, the literature is chock full of it. But actually, the first riders rode their own bikes. And there was an amazing variety of machines. Here is a lovely aerial. And this aerial, of course, in the period, has belt drive from the gearbox, but it has a 3-speed gearbox. And it's got footboards instead of footrests. And the engine is a famous engine, a proprietary engine, not made by Ariel, but made by White and Pop, which was a very, very well-known machine, very well-known engine maker. And the BSA, which was also a very popular machine in the day. And this again had a proper gearbox and proper belt drive. And one of the little features I love about these early BSAs, does anybody know what these handlebar grips are made of? Sorry? Oh, well, buffalo horn. They're literally made of buffalo horn. And one of the things that you see on these early bikes is these little features which distinguish a proper restoration, or a proper survivor has those little tiny features. And the buffalo horn, you could literally drop the bike on a hard surface and the buffalo horn would survive, because of course it was the horn of a buffalo. It was designed to take huge impact without damage, because it was meant to be growing out the head of a buffalo. So those were the kind of things people used in those days, rather than rubber, which would have just perished. And there's the little flat twin Douglas. And what's curious about this bike, it's got a little flat twin engine which drives the gearbox, and it's got a belt driving the back wheel with a 2-speed gearbox. But this bike doesn't have a kickstart and doesn't have a clutch. It's kind of weird, but you literally push it along in bottom gear until it's running, and it just takes off like a sewing machine. Very sweet little bike. And then you just jump it into top gear. So these have got 2 speeds but no clutch. And when you stop the bike, you have to stop the engine. You can't keep the engine running while the bike is stopped, because there's no way of disconnecting the drive. And those were absolutely popular as anything. And even people who look at the Sunbeam, which was the sort of gentleman's motorcycle, characterised by this lovely black and gold finish. Gold lines made of real gold leaf. And this tin cover over the chain that drove, this is very modern in terms of engineering. Gearbox, proper 3-speed gearbox, and a tin cover over the chain, which meant that the chain remained clean and lubricated in the worst mud. The reason that people took these to the front, because anybody who rode a Sunbeam and had a Sunbeam and got a job as a dispatch rider really felt like Cock of the North, because they had the best bike for the job. Why did the army not buy them? For a very simple reason. Because a Sunbeam cost practically twice what the ordinary bikes cost. So this was what you would call the gentleman's machine. And one or two happy dispatch riders took their Sunbeams to the front, and they were great, but they were too expensive. And of course also, if the chain guarding got damaged, it was very difficult to repair in the conditions of the front. The more robust belt drive bikes, which were simpler and more rugged, survived rather better. Now, one of the bikes that was used extensively in the early part of the war was the Rudge Multi. And of course, the Rudge Multi, I'm sure people that are here are familiar with the idea. You have an expanding pulley on the engine and an expanding pulley on the back wheel. And the back wheel consists of two wheels, one inside the other. You can see how many spokes it has. It has 80 spokes. 40 spokes hold the wheel rim and one side of the belt rim. And the second set of 40 spokes are laced to a second hub, which slides over the top of the first, or the smaller inside hub. And that second half of the rim moves in and out, and it changes the effective diameter of the rear pulley. So as you change the diameter of the front pulley, if you make the front pulley bigger, the back wheel opens up to make the back rim smaller. So as you change the gear ratio, when the engine is running, the belt is running, you can open one pulley up and close the other one down. And that changes the gear ratio. And to control it, you have this long lever. And the long lever has 13 notches on a bracket on the bottom of the tank. So you've got 13 different ratios. That sounds very good, and it's a bit like the DAF. You remember the DAF Variomatic? That's what that has, variable transmission using a belt. But there's a fundamental problem with this thing. Inside this chamber here, there's a multi-plate clutch. Literally 50 steel plates, and each plate has either got 4 little lobes on the outside or 4 little lobes on the inside. So when you put them all together, you've got a stack of plates, and inside this tube there are 4 grooves, and on the shaft there's 4 grooves. So the plates with spikes on the inside grip the main shaft, and the spikes on the outside grip the housing. And on the outside there's a big spring that presses them all together. So you've got 50 little plates about 2 inches diameter, all with bare metal, there's no friction material, and they all sit together, and at the end there's a spring. And there's a mechanism here operated by this cable, which is like 2 saws, 2 tube saws that sit together, and when you rotate one against the other, they take the spring load off the plates, and suddenly the clutch releases. And because it's metal on metal running in thin oil, it's absolutely beautiful. It grips beautifully, and it slips beautifully, and there's no friction material to wear out, there's no cork to wear out, totally reliable. But for one fatal problem, which the dispatch riders unfortunately discovered. And the fatal flaw is this. When you're riding a Rudge Multi, in order to change the gearing, the pulley at the front and the pulley at the back have to be running. So when you actually operate this lever, this is in the starting position, with the pulley at the front at the smallest diameter, and the pulley at the back at the largest diameter. So if you want to go from low gear to high gear, you have to be running the bike. So you start the bike running, you pedal it to start, pedaling gear here, you start the bike, you're now in low gear, so you release the clutch and the bike starts to run. And the minute you start to run, the rider pushes the lever forward, and as he pushes the lever forward, the belt starts to go onto a larger pulley at the front and a smaller pulley at the back. And it changes the gear, and it's beautiful. Now you're riding along with your Despatch, and you're going quite fast, and you're in a high gear. So now you think, gosh, is that a sniper? And quite a lot of riders had difficulty distinguishing the noise of their exhaust from the noise of gunfire, which is a problem if you're trying to save your life. So what they would do is they would stop suddenly. And when they stopped suddenly, the clutch lever here, which is actually on the handlebars, has got a little latch, which is exactly the same. You can see it and have a look at it on here. The actual clutch on this machine has a latch on it, so you can hold the clutch open while you have the engine running and you don't want the wheel turning. So it's exactly the same with the rudge. So you stop the bike with the clutch latched open. So now the engine is disconnected from the bike. But here's the problem. You're stopped. You're on the road. And your gear is in high gear. And you can't start riding the bike again until you've put the bike into low gear. How do you put the bike into low gear? You put the bike up on the stand, you then start the bike, you then maneuver the lever from the forward high gear position back to the low gear position. You now pull in the clutch, you take the bike back off the stand, put the clip, the stand actually doesn't need to be clipped up, it's got springs, so it springs up and locks. But in the meantime, you're dead because you've been shot by a sniper. So what did rudge riders do when they had this situation? And it happened repeatedly. And again, it's described in the book. And having owned and ridden rudge multis, I can understand exactly what the problem was like. If you're in the middle of the front and you were being sniped at, which was a common occurrence, more common than you'd imagine, and you realised what was happening and you had this occur, you abandoned your bike and you ran off. So rudges that were taken to the front, and there's rudges in the book, there are pictures of Willie Watson riding a rudge, and there are also descriptions of how the rudges, one way or another, were abandoned, and they just ceased to be, because they simply didn't pass muster when it came to what the Despatch riders had to do with their bikes when they were actually riding them. So this wonderful bike, as a rudge multi, most people would say is a good veteran. It's a good veteran if you're riding in a modern event like the Banbury Run, but it's no good if you're being sniped at, because if you stop with it in high gear, you're basically dead. So that was a fundamental flaw. And again, it's mentioned in the book, but it's mentioned in a way that you wouldn't understand what the real problem was unless somebody like me who knows about these things explained it. And indeed, that's partly what I've done in the book. We've actually explained some of these little wrinkles about what skills were needed to make these bikes work. Because when you think about it, in 1914, when the war started, the motorcycle was a sort of plaything of wealthy people and young sort of people with an inclination to engineering. But at the end of the First World War, motorcycles had essentially proven themselves as reliable utilitarian vehicles. And after the war, people who'd ridden bikes because they had been Despatch riders came back from the war and wanted to be motorcyclists in civilian clothes. So there was a huge upsurge of interest, and motorcycling really took off after the First World War was ended, when people came back from the war having had the experience of riding. So it's an absolutely fascinating period. And there's the kind of commonplace triumph, but again, the triumph that most people think of as being the Despatch rider's bike is called a Model H. And the Model H has a gearbox which sits in here. But this Triumph has a pulley on the engine and a back wheel which has got a gearbox inside the back wheel. So this is what we would call nowadays a veteran Triumph, because this model lasted till the end of 1914. And all the bikes that are described in the book Adventures of a Despatch Rider were Triumphs like this, which were built up to the end of 1914. And it was only in 1915 when Kitchener had his new army start to arrive in France, and the army was buying bikes to give to people who they trained to be dispatch riders, not the people in the first part who were all basically motorcyclists. When they were supplying bikes, the Model H, which has got the gearbox, was a much better bike because it had a kickstart, it had a chain primary drive, and it had a clutch. So you had a 3-speed gearbox with a clutch, just like a kind of modern bike. Belt drive, final drive. But this veteran bike, with the engine driving to the back wheel with the hub gear, was what they were actually riding in 1914, which is not the bike that most people think of. Now this is the Blackburn, and of course you can see here, again, the big characteristic feature was the flywheel. And again, the interesting thing about that was that when the Burney brothers went as young men in 1903 to be apprentices at an engineering firm in the Midlands, there was a big firm in Rugby called Willans and Robinson. And Willans and Robinson, you might recognise the name English Electric. Does the name English Electric mean something to you? Right, well, English Electric was formed in 1919 of an amalgamation of about half a dozen firms. But the company that was the core of the business was Willans and Robinson. And in 1870 and 1880, Willans and Robinson, which was a general engineering company in Rugby, started manufacturing generating sets because in the late Victorian period, everybody that lived in a big country house didn't want to use gas lighting or oil lighting. In fact, if you lived out in the country, oil lighting was the way because you couldn't get gas, because gas had to come from a town. And it was usually called town gas because it was only supplied in towns. But if you lived in a country house, you could go to Willans and Robinson and buy a generating set, which was a big engine that ran on paraffin, driving a dynamo, and you now had electric lighting. So the wealthy people in the country houses of Britain had generating sets made by Willans and Robinson. And of course, in order to make these things, they had a very big workforce, and Willans and Robinson had one of the biggest apprentice schools in the whole of Britain. And this Willans and Robinson Apprentice School was a hotbed of engineering interest. And when the Burney brothers went there in 1903, there were other people at the apprentice school whose names you might recognise. One was Geoffrey de Havilland, who was became a famous aviator. And also two guys called Archie Fraser-Nash and Ron Godfrey. Archie Fraser-Nash went on to build Fraser-Nash cars and also built turrets for Lancaster bombers. And Archie Fraser-Nash and Ron Godfrey built a little cycle car called the GN, which again you might have heard of, built in the 20s, well, built in the 1900s. All these guys met at the apprentice school at Willans and Robinson. And when in 1905, Geoffrey de Havilland announced to his friends at the school he wanted to go off and become an aviator because he was very interested in aviation, he had already built a motorcycle for his own use in the apprentice school. He had help from the foreman at the apprentice school, and helped Geoffrey de Havilland take a design of an engine, which is essentially just this engine. So it's a 500cc engine with a detachable head and a big flywheel, a big outside flywheel. And this engine is essentially this was 1912, 1913. This engine, which is this one here, is exactly the engine designed by Geoffrey de Havilland in 1905. And when Geoffrey de Havilland left Willans and Robinson, he sold to the Burney brothers the drawings, the patterns for making the castings, and he had a number of unmachined castings. And he said to them, you build them, you have fun, because I'm going off to build aircraft. So what did the Burney brothers do? They used the drawings and the patterns, and they made a motorcycle for each of them. And they actually built, I think, 2 or 3 others. So in 1906, 1907, the de Havilland motorcycles were being competed in competitions all around the Midlands, ridden by Cecil and Alec Burney. They were actually built by Cecil and Alec Burney at the apprentice school at Willans and Robinson. So then move right along to 1912, and the Burney brothers have done so well with their de Havilland motorcycle that they said to themselves, let's make them, let's sell them, let's make a business of it. So that was fine. So they approached their friend Geoffrey de Havilland, who was of course now properly building and flying aircraft, and said, Geoffrey, we want to use your engine design and we're going to start making de Havilland motorcycles. And Geoffrey de Havilland said, whoa, you can't do that. You know, I was involved in the early ones and you built them for yourself. But if you're doing this as an enterprise, you need to call them Bernies or something. You can't go calling them de Havillands because I'm not involved. I'm now building aircraft. And the other problem that the Bernies had was no money. So Geoffrey de Havilland introduced them to one of his fellow pioneer aviators, a chap called Harold Blackburn. So Harold Blackburn was a wealthy young man building aircraft like Geoffrey de Havilland. So Harold Blackburn agreed to provide working capital, £200 in 1912. Harold Blackburn provided so that the Burney and Blackburn company could be founded. And in 1913, they started building bikes, and that's one of them. And those bikes were built, and they were called Burney and Blackburn. And the original Blackburn is Blackburn without an E. And of course, the Bernies, the word Burney is like the back half of Blackburn. So quite quickly, the company added the letter E to Blackburn, which is like a kind of way of conflating the words Burney and Blackburn by adding the E of Burney into the Blackburn of Harold Blackburn. And this bike still has its original paintwork. One of the things I was so pleased with this bike was that it kept all the original finish on it that we could. Because bits of the bike were missing. The whole back end of the frame was actually missing. But the central part of the frame and the forks were there. And the tank still had the word Blackburn with an E on it on the side of the tank. So I was able to put the bike back together, and all I did essentially was clean the tank and managed to solder up 2 tiny little holes in the tank so it holds petrol. And that's another one of the features of the bike which is so pleasing, because it's the only veteran Blackburn in the world, and it's still got its original paintwork on the tank and on other bits as well. And even the engine has not all been refinished. It's literally always been cleaned carefully and assembled and runs like a dream. So that's the story of that. And that was again the way in which these things happen. Now, one of the pictures that was in the album, which we had real trouble figuring out what it was all about. This, of course, is the Bar A car that Grimers and Huggy rescued from the no man's land at Misi with a can of petrol under cover of moonlight. And this is Spuggy Bagshaw with his little corporal's flashes on his shoulder. And Spuggy went off after Ypres back to South Africa to run his father's bootmaking business. And this is a rather nice aerial that he had. Now, can anybody see what this is? I looked at this picture for ages. London buses. So to get the troops to the front at Ypres, they sent out from London a whole fleet of London General B-type omnibuses. And because they were going to troop transportation duties instead of the public round London, they put armour plating on them. Armour plating. You know, they still had an outside stair and open seating, but they had rudimentary armour plating, thin sheets of steel tacked on to try and deflect, I suppose, rifle fire. And these are the lined up B-type general buses about to take troops to the front at Ypres. Now, I don't know how many pictures you've seen of a London bus taking troops to the front at Ypres, but just to find that picture, what you can still see it has a lot of light damage on it, and it's not in particularly perfect condition. But the picture conveys such a powerful image of what they actually went through. That's about it. That was the last shot that I put up. I think it's just gone to a blank screen. So there are copies of the book here. I thought that it would be nice if the museum could have books to essentially people could take away and read the story of the bike and everything else, because the book itself, the original 1915 book, is a fantastically well written book. The guy that wrote it, who was William Watson, was obviously a very talented guy. And when we republished it, what we've done is we very faithfully reproduced the original book inside our reprinted book. So there are copies of the book available. There was another book which we had access to, which is called VPK, which is the story of the Vest Pocket Kodak camera, which itself is an integral part of this whole story. Because had it not been for the photography done by the soldiers with their own cameras, none of this would have been possible. None of it would have been possible. And of course, when you look at the pictures now in the book illustrating the scenes that they illustrate, you have a completely different view of the book when you just read it without pictures. When you read the original book, you have the maps showing where they were, but the pictures give a whole extra layer of significance to the whole thing. It's just absolutely lovely. So I don't know if people have any questions about any aspect. Yeah.
Well, the young men who took their own bikes, will they compensate if the bikes got damaged?
Well, no. The bikes were bought at the time they brought the bikes. They basically, there was a list of. It's all actually written. Not wishing as a sales pitch. It's all written up in the book. There's actually a specification which the bikes had to meet. They had to have at least 2 gears. They had to have a clutch. They had to be mainly 4 strokes, because 4 strokes were deemed to be more reliable. And they also, when they brought them, they had to demonstrate that they themselves, because they were going to be riding them, they had to demonstrate that they could do simple jobs, like, for example, changing a wheel or changing a tyre, or that kind of thing. So when they brought their bikes to Chatham to be recruited, they were asked to perform simple tasks on their own bikes. And at that point, they were then assessed, and a valuation was given, and they were paid by the army. They were given the King's shilling for recruiting. They were paid a modest, as I said, they called it the King's shilling. They were given a shilling nominally to be recruited, but also they were paid a sum in compensation. So the bikes became the army's property, but they, being the riders and former owners, were expected to maintain their own bike. There's a band brake on the front wheel. Now, one of the things I dislike about early bikes, particularly when you're riding on modern roads, is when you meet modern cars that go past you and think, oh, that's a nice bike, and they clap on the brakes and you run into the back of them, because you can't stop as well as a modern car can stop. But I had an elderly friend who told me about band brake, and he'd given me the drum of a band brake. But the reason he had never used it was because it was off a veteran BSA. And veteran BSAs, unlike more or less every other bike, had only 32 spokes in the front wheel. So the drum was drilled for 8 attachment screws, which are the crossing points of the 32. It's basically 16 spokes on each side crossed over. So there are 8 crossing points. So the drillings on that drum were designed to fit a veteran BSA. Now, what's rather clever about this wheel, I had to rebuild the wheel, and I couldn't find a 32-hole hub. And if you're a very sharp eye, you'll spot that it's got a 32-hole rim laced to a 40-hole hub. And there are basically 4 holes on each side, which are empty. So it's got 32 spokes laced into a 40-hole hub, and there's 4 equally spaced holes on each side. So I've cheated. But what it meant was I've got 8 crossing points, and I was able to use my friend Lee Collin, who was a founding member of the Vintage Club in 1946. He gave me that rim, and I was able to fit it to the wheel. And it's the most fantastic brake. And in fact, you can simple extinction. And I had to devise the method of making the brake operate. And one of the problems you have with the band brake is you have a puncture. How do you take the wheel out? Well, with this version, the assembly of the brake strap is attached to this lever with a left-hand threaded spindle. So when you want to take the wheel out, you disconnect the brake cable, you unscrew the brake lever in the opposite direction, so it goes right-handed. It's unscrewing the left-hand thread right-handed. You unscrew the shaft out, and you just leave the whole band in place on the wheel. So you take the whole wheel with the band out, and then you fix the puncture, put the whole wheel back in, and then reassemble the brake lever. Now, that isn't the original design. And the reason I did it was because I wanted something which was more practical. But again, people who've seen this want them. The minute people see them, they want them.
Yes.
And it's up to others to make them, and I can have the share the data. But that was a tiny little detail. Sorry? Martinside did, yes. Now, I don't know if people have seen the Royal Enfield. Royal Enfield in lockdown came to me about something like May 2020. The guy who is one of their brand managers, Gordon May, who you may have heard, has done a lot of long distance motorcycling on a Royal Enfield. He's ridden to Vietnam, and he's ridden to South Africa, and he's written each of these big journeys up as a book. And you see him at the Classic Bike Show selling copies of his book all about the big journeys he's done. He's a very nice guy. And he's one of the brand managers. And when the lockdown was started, Royal Enfield have a design house based at Bruntingthorpe in the Midlands, which is a former RAF base, which is where their technical centre is, where they design bikes in Britain. But they build them in a factory in what was called Madras, Chennai, which is in India. So the factory is owned in India and run in India, and that's where they build the bikes, but they design them in Britain. And when the lockdown problem started, they used Zoom. They were one of the early adopters, as I suppose we all became familiar with Zoom in lockdown when we couldn't get out. We used to talk to people on our computers. And I got asked, well, what happened was Gordon May gave a talk to the company employees, both in India and in Britain, all about the history of the Royal Enfield company. And he said, well, of course, the first bikes that we built were built in 1901, but they were like a bicycle with an engine above the front wheel, which drove the back wheel with a great big long 10-foot long belt. And he said, it's perhaps unsurprising that none of them have survived. So in lockdown, why don't we get some volunteers together to build a copy of the first ever Royal Enfield so that we can see what it was like and we can have fun riding it. Well, he came off the Zoom call, which was about an hour-long story about the history of the Royal Enfield Company, and his boss rushed into his office and said, Gordon, what a brilliant idea, let's do it. And of course, Gordon had really put it out there as a silly idea, because in lockdown, people really didn't know what the future held. So Gordon then was told by his boss, do it. So Gordon then thought, I don't know anything about a 1901 motorcycle. We need to find somebody who does. Well, after a bit of scrabbling about, somebody put my name into the hat. And I got a phone call out of the blue about 3 weeks later from Gordon May. Are you Martin Shelley? Yes, I'm Martin. Do you know about early motorcycles? Well, I do a bit, yes. He said, well, I've just been tasked to help a group of volunteers from the company build a replica of the 1901 Royal Enfield. And I said, well, the funny thing is, I don't really know anything about a 1901 Royal Enfield. What information do you have? Well, he said, we have a sales leaflet from 1901, which not only shows the whole bike, it also shows the engine and bits of it, like the valves, and other bits of it, like the special carburetor that they had, and so on and so on. But he said there are no surviving examples, but there is one or perhaps two photographs of the bike when it was new. I said, Gordon, send me what you have. So an email arrived a day later with all these bits and pieces, the copy of the catalogue, two pictures that existed, one showing one side of the bike and one showing the four people who built the first one with the other side of the bike. And I sat puzzling, looking at it, thinking, how on earth do we build one of these? And I said to Gordon, we need to build it a proper copy. There's no point in trying to find an engine and fit it in a bike. It was like a bicycle with an engine over the front wheel, but there was no way we could just cobble something up. We had to make something. And the team at Bruntingthorpe had all the latest computer-aided design technology. But I realised that the engine was very like a de Dion-Bouton engine, which was one of the first proper successful internal combustion engines. And I knew people in the de Dion-Bouton club who had made repairs for early de Dion-Bouton engine tricycles, which were like bicycles with 3 wheels, which had an engine like the engine in the Royal Enfield. So I said, why don't we start with a brand new cylinder head from a de Dion-Bouton tricycle, which is 1899, so it's the right kind of period. And we basically designed the bike in that way. We designed it around this engine. But then I realised in my workshop, I had the proper wheels for the bike, I had the proper forks for the bike, and I had all sorts of other bits and pieces. So I said to them, if you like, have all this stuff. So I sent it all down to Bruntingthorpe, and the bike was actually finished and launched as a finished replica at the big motorcycle show in 2021 at Milan, called EICMA, the EICMA International Motorcycle Show at Milan. And they had it under a black cloth, and they pulled the black cloth off. Here is this replica of this 1901 bike. Well, Gordon, when the Commonwealth Games flame was being paraded around Britain on its way to the Commonwealth Games in Manchester, the flame arrived in Redditch, which is where the Royal Enfield factories used to be, and Gordon rode on the 1901 replica carrying the Commonwealth Games flame for 2 miles and then handed it on to the next person. And they'd arranged a van to go to where the bike was going to be finishing its procession, to bring the bike back to the start. And when the guy got to the end of the procession, there was no sign of Gordon, because Gordon had just handed the baton on, turned the bike round and ridden it back the 2 miles, which wasn't in the plan. But that's what happened. So now, because I helped put this thing together, the Royal Enfield factory at Bruntingthorpe is having an open day tomorrow. And I've been cordially invited to go and ride the prototype. So that's what I'm doing tomorrow. On my way back to Scotland, I'm giving this talk today, I'm going to ride the 1901 replica Royal Enfield. And the guy that's really got it going has now fallen in love with it. But the factory wanted to build half a dozen. I said, no, we're building one. I've only got one set of wheel parts and one cylinder head that we've managed to get, and so on and so on. So it's been a fantastic journey. And of course, people that see the bike can actually see what people were offered in 1901. And it's actually not like riding a modern motorcycle at all. It's like riding a bicycle with a doof, 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 slow revving engine on the front. And it just is so amazing. And I kind of feel proud of the fact that although it's a replica, it's so like the original. And it's been really successful. I'm sure I wrote a piece about how it was done for the Vintage Club magazine, which appeared in February's magazine. And anybody that wants to know, I've got copies of the article as a PDF. So.
That's a very nice article.
Sorry?
That's a very nice article. I read that with great enthusiasm.
Well, the point was I wanted it to be told truthfully, because nobody's kidding anybody that it's the original thing. But what I can't believe is how like the original it really is. And not only how it looks, it's how it goes. And that's what I'm really looking forward to at Bruntingthorpe tomorrow. And we're lucky that we've got a good weather forecast. I thought it would be just my luck to be pouring with rain. Right. Any other questions?
Who did the castings for the engine?
Well, that's another story. You know the name. I'm going to quote your name. When the Burney brothers wanted to build these bikes, there were 2 guys living in Berkhamsted, up north of London, but they had a local bicycle shop that would build the frames and build the cycle parts. But the engines, they had to find somebody who would make the engines. And in their connections through the aviation business, they knew a company called AC, Auto Carriers, who built cars in Thames Ditton. And they had a big engineering, Kingston on Thames and Thames Ditton.
They started at West Norwood, you know. AC.
Yeah. and it was Mr. Weller and Mr. Portwine,
Yeah.
John Weller and Mr. Portwine. And they built AC autocarriers, which were single-cylinder, three-wheeled delivery vehicles. But they were given the drawings of these engines, and they built the two engines for the prototypes.
Yeah.
And it's very likely they built the engine in that bike there. But there's nothing on the engine that tells you it was made by anybody, because it's got no name on it at all.
Yeah.
But it was autocarriers at Thames Ditton. And then when the company started going after the war, they used a company called Gillette and Stevens in Brookham, Great Brookham, and they were the ones who built them. And they built the machines. And then OEC, the company that I'm the mark specialist for as well, started making the bikes for them. Because they built the engines, but they really only wanted to build the engines. So OEC started building the bikes.
Burmel.
Burmel was an
they,
aluminium foundry.
well, they made the crankcases for better sets.
Yeah.
And also I came across their logo on their leather
Yes,
as well.
yes.
So,
But when you see the later Blackwell engines, they have the letters GS cast into them, and the GS is Gillette and Stevens.
Yeah.
And Gillette and Stevens, during the First World War, were very involved in rebuilding tank engines.
oh yeah.
12-cylinder Liberty tank engines.
Yeah.
And that's what they started out doing, and then they ended up engineering the Burney and Blackburn engines. And then the Blackburn engine company went from strength to strength. They won the TT in 1923, and they went on from there.
Were they a victim of the slump?
Sorry?
Were they a victim of the
No,
slump?
not really. They survived the slump. But what happened was they got very interested in building other kinds of machinery.
Yeah.
So the factory stopped making motorcycle engines in the mid-30s, up to about 1935. And then they went on to other work. They built aircraft engines, they built car engines.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing, the whole bike is a great bike. It runs very well. If we had a moment, I could attempt to start it outside, but I'm sure the museum might be turning blue. Sammy Miller managed to ride it. As I say, if you look at the antique road trip, there's a picture of Sammy riding it around at Bash and Manor, which I was deeply impressed by, because he's obviously got better legs than I've got.
Yeah.
But he's an amazing character. He's an amazing character. But it's been just a fantastic journey. Finding the bike, finding the book, finding the albums, and the way it all kind of fell together. And then we got a publisher that made a beautiful job. The book, I don't know if you've seen the copy, there's one or two people who've got copies of the book, but it's an absolutely fantastic. The whole story is almost beyond imagining, really. And of course, it's a true story, as far as it can be.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. That's really interesting. The museum is open until 5, so if you want to come and wander around. The bike will be going on display at the other end of that gallery, the truck gallery, hopefully for next week. We've got a few other things on, this is not a priority, so your tickets which you got today, you've got a ticket, gives you progress access, so you can come back and see it anytime. The archive materials that Martin was very kind of lent will also be going on display when the case turns up.
How would you?
Well, it's vanished, but it doesn't turn up at some point, and the text pan as well, so do come back and have a look. And if you have any more questions, I'm sure Martin will be very
I was just going to point out one of the pictures that Rebecca chose for the display here is this picture of me, Captain Tibbles, and Merchant in this right-hand sidecar outfit. And of course, in France in 1914, in the winter of 1940, it was a very cold and snowy season. And of course, this is a right-hand chair, so it's a French chair. So there's the Quartermaster Sergeant Tibbles, who's actually sitting in the chair, made it his business to try and get things to help keep running the dispatch riders when they were in France. And of course, they hadn't got sidecars because they were all basically solo bikes. But they managed to find French sidecars, and that's a French sidecar, which is on the right-hand side. And Tibbles is sitting in there enjoying the fact that he's managed to find a sidecar, and they put it on the bike. So they ended up riding it safely in bad weather, because the sidecar was good for when you're in bad weather. Strictly speaking, I should think.
Don't work in the dark. You know, so we're probably going to do that today.
That's oil, and that's petrol. Yeah. The oil's in the front corner.
Monday.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, 8 o'clock is Monday. He's got email.
And these, of course, are the AMAC, the proper AMACs. Yeah, I know. But again, all the right bits. And this little, have you seen the little locking clutch lever?
Brings head Monday, because it's tough
Well,
Monday.
it's little latch.
Yeah.
Locks it open. You get them on lawnmowers as well. Brad's multis have them. And lawnmowers have them in the veteran black room. I think that's starting out.
Yeah, I've got better forks, but yeah, it just twists.
As you pull the thing,
But it hasn't got springs.
push it. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Well, all I can say also is too careful with the wheel.
Private church.
Look at the other side. Look at this side.
You turn off. Between 5 and 5.
No, no. That rim, the rim brake is the hard rim. I mean, this will back it up as well. Look carefully now. Two pieces of tube. I've just sent that to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll come out to the
Are
car.
you really?
Yes, I'm the only person.
We'll
Everyone
come out
else
to the car.
Right, now,
I'll just have a
two
quick.
things I need to do.
Yeah,
I need to get this man a book.
yeah. Ruta's on.
Yeah.
Do you like my bike?
Yeah, I know. I'll just get a quick shot of the bike. And it's,
You want more
I
coffee?
really want to. I would really like to.